Marcus Vale's boots hit the porch of Blackthorn Ridge like he owned it already. He didn't knock. Men like Marcus Vale didn't knock on doors they planned to take. Mercer? He looked at the old rancher the way a man looks at something already dead. Winter's coming and you've got a widow cooking your meals. Sign the paper now and I'll let you stay in the east cabin through spring. Don't, and I'll watch the bank take everything you built. Caleb's hands tightened on his cane, but said nothing. Marcus smiled, the kind that meant he'd already won. He hadn't counted on the woman standing in the doorway behind them. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, subscribe and follow the channel. Because this is only the beginning. The handcart had one good wheel. Eliza Vane had known this since Rollins, where the left wheel cracked, crossing a frozen rut, and she'd spent 40 minutes in the dark lashing it back together with a strip of leather cut from the bottom of her coat. Her coat was shorter now. The wind found that gap every time it wanted to remind her what month it was. November, Wyoming, 1887. She didn't let herself think past that. Mama, her daughter Clara, 8 years old and thin as fence wire, tugged at her sleeve. How much farther? Not much. You said that before. I know. You said it in Rollins, too. Eliza didn't answer. She leaned into the cart and kept walking. Her son Eli, 10, walked ahead with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He hadn't complained once since they left the last town, which should have been a comfort, but wasn't. Boys his age should complain. They should beg to stop. The fact that he didn't meant he understood more than she wanted him to. The Blackthorn Ridge Road was barely a road. It was more of a suggestion pressed into frozen ground by wagon wheels that hadn't come this way in some time. The tracks were old. The posts that marked the turnoff were leaning, one of them split down the middle. The painted name nearly gone. She read it anyway. Blackthorn Ridge. 2 miles. She'd gotten the name from a man at the freight office in Rollins who'd said, offhand, that old Caleb Mercer was probably desperate enough to take anyone. She'd asked him to repeat it. He had, with a look that said he meant it as a warning, not a recommendation. She'd written the name on the inside of her wrist in pencil so she wouldn't lose it. The pencil had smeared in the rain 2 days ago. She still knew the name. They came over a rise and she saw it below. A low cluster of buildings tucked against a hillside. Smoke rising from one chimney in a thin gray thread that bent sideways in the wind before it even cleared the roof. The barn was large, maybe once impressive. The house looked like it had given up arguing with the weather. Clara said, "Is that it?" "That's it." "It looks tired." Eliza let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "It does." "Are we going to live there?" "We're going to try." She started down the slope, leaning back against the cart's weight, keeping the bad wheel from getting ahead of itself. Eli moved to the other side without being asked and pressed his shoulder against the frame. They didn't talk about it. They just did it. That was how things worked now. The man who answered the door didn't look like a rancher who needed help. He looked like a rancher who didn't believe help existed anymore. Caleb Mercer was somewhere past 60, built like a man who'd once been very strong and hadn't quite forgiven himself for not being that way anymore. He had a cane, a heavy one, dark wood, worn smooth where his hand gripped it. His right leg was stiff. She didn't ask about it. His face was the kind that had been outdoors for 40 years, which meant it didn't show much, but his eyes did. His eyes looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't fit where it's landed. "I'm Eliza Vane," she said. "I was told you might need help." He looked at her, then at the children behind her, then at the handcart. "Who told you that?" "Man at the freight office in Rollins." "Tall man? Scar on his chin?" "Yes." Caleb made a sound like he wasn't sure whether to be angry at her or at the man in Rollins. "I need a ranch hand," he said, "not a cook." "I can cook," Eliza said. "I can also do whatever else needs doing. You're a woman with 2 children and a broken cart." "I'm aware of that. I've had 3 men turn this position down in the last 6 weeks. You know why?" "The pay?" "The work," he said. "This isn't a soft winter posting. The cold here will kill livestock and crack timber. I've got a barn that needs 2 people to manage, and I can barely get around on this leg. I need someone who can do real work. Then let me. He stared at her. Mr. Mercer, she said, keeping her voice even, I have walked 40 miles in the last 5 days. My daughter's shoes have a hole in the left sole that I've been stuffing with paper every morning. My son hasn't eaten since yesterday because we gave the last of our bread to a woman on the road who hadn't eaten in 3 days. I am not here because I have other options. I'm here because I don't. But I promise you, if you let me in, you will not regret it. Caleb looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the smoke twisting sideways from the chimney. Then he stepped back from the door. Cooking, he said. Room and board and a small wage in spring if you're still here. I'm not promising anything beyond that. I'm not asking you to. She pushed the cart toward the porch. The inside of the house was worse than the outside suggested, which she hadn't expected. The main room was large but low-ceilinged, the kind of space that should have been warm but wasn't, because the chimney wasn't drawing right. She could tell from the smell. Smoke had been backing up and seeping into the walls for months. The ceiling above the hearth was stained dark in a spreading ring. The wood stored beside the stove was damp. Someone had been bringing it in from outside too soon, before it had time to dry under cover. She didn't say any of this. She put her things in the small room he showed her, barely big enough for the cot and a trunk, and she put the children on the cot together and told them to stay warm while she started supper. In the kitchen, she surveyed what she had to work with. The stove was iron, old but salvageable. The pots were decent. The provisions were low but not desperate. Cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, a small wheel of hard cheese, some flour. She made a thick soup and cornbread, and while she cooked, she moved quietly through the kitchen cataloging everything. The window that didn't close flush, the gap below the back door where cold air poured in like water, the storage shelf that had water damage on the bottom board, the way the smoke still crept sideways from the stove burner even with the flue open because the chimney cap was wrong. She didn't say anything at dinner. Caleb ate without talking. The children ate like they were afraid someone might take the food back. Eliza ate last and ate less than she served. After the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with a stub of candle and a piece of paper she'd kept since Rawlins and started writing down everything she'd seen. She didn't sleep much. She never did anymore. In the morning, she was up before Caleb, which seemed to surprise him. She had the stove going with wood she'd found under the overhang outside, drier than what was stacked inside, and coffee made from the last of his tin, and she'd stuffed the gap under the back door with folded burlap sacking she'd found in the mudroom. He came into the kitchen and stopped. You moved the wood stack, he said. The inside stack is wet. It's slowing the fire and making the smoke worse. He looked at the door. That's my burlap. I found it in the mudroom. I'll replace it when I find something better. He sat down. Didn't say anything, took the coffee. The chimney needs clearing, she said, pouring herself a cup and staying on her feet. There's a partial blockage. Something built a nest up there in the fall. Birds, maybe, or squirrels. The flue is open, but the draw is wrong. That's why the smoke backs up. Caleb wrapped both hands around his mug. I know about the chimney. Do you have a chimney brush? In the barn, upper left. Don't know if it's any good. I'll look at it today. He watched her over his mug. You said you could cook. I can cook and I can also clear a chimney. Both of those things are true. A woman going up on my roof is going to fix your chimney, she said, unless you plan to do it yourself. He said nothing. She took that as agreement and went to find the brush. The brush was old and the handle had a crack in it that she wrapped with wire from a broken fence spool she found at the bottom of the supply barrel. She went up on the roof in the mid-morning with the brush and a length of rope she tied to the chimney stack for safety, and she worked for the better part of 2 hours clearing the blockage. It was birds, a massive packed nest of grass and mud and small bones that had been there, she estimated, since summer. Eli held the rope from the roof edge, standing well back, not speaking unless she spoke to him. From up there she could see the whole ranch spread out below. The barn, the paddock fence that needed 2 new rails on the east side, the water trough that had a lean to it, the outbuildings, a smokehouse, and a root cellar, and a smaller structure she couldn't identify from here. She turned slowly and looked at the land. The hills rolled in every direction. The grass was brown and brittle. The sky to the northwest was the color of an old bruise. She made a mental note of the sky. Then she finished with the chimney and came down. That afternoon, the fire in the hearth burned clean for the first time, Caleb said, in months. The smoke went up and stayed up. The room was warmer by nightfall than it had been in what she guessed was a long time. She could tell by the way he sat closer to it than he probably intended to. He didn't thank her. She didn't need him to. 3 days later, the Harlow brothers came. They ran the nearest neighboring ranch, 8 miles east. 2 of them, both broad-shouldered and loud, the kind of men who filled up a room by volume alone. Pete Harlow was the older one, with a red beard and an easy grin that didn't reach his eyes. Denny was younger and smarter and worked harder to hide it. They rode up mid-morning while Eliza was repairing the paddock fence. She'd found the loose rails and pulled them free to cut fresh lengths from the timber she'd spotted behind the barn. Good dry pine, stored properly, unlike everything else. She was nailing the first new rail when she heard the horses. Pete Harlow reined in and looked at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression men used when they saw something that didn't make sense to them and decided the problem was the thing, not their understanding. "Mercer hire himself a carpenter?" Pete said. "Fence repair," Eliza said, not looking up from the nail. "Where's Caleb?" "Inside." "Who are you?" She drove the nail, said another one. "Eliza Vane. I work here." Pete looked at Denny. Denny looked at the fence. "She's nailing fence," Pete said, as though Denny might have missed it. "I can see that," Denny said. "Huh." Pete swung down off his horse and walked toward her with his thumbs in his belt. "Caleb's got a woman doing fence work now. What's next? Knitting his saddles?" Eliza kept working. "I'm talking to you," Pete said. "I heard you," she said. "The fence needed fixing. I'm fixing it. I'm not sure what's confusing about that." Pete's grin went a little tighter. "You got a mouth on you." "You rode over to tell Caleb something, I assume. He's in the house." She didn't look at him again. After a moment, she heard his boots move off toward the porch, and when she glanced sideways, she saw Denny still sitting on his horse, watching her work with an expression that wasn't dismissive. It was something more careful than that. She went back to the fence. Inside, Pete told Caleb that Marcus Vale had been making the rounds, buying up the smaller parcels along the valley. 3 properties in 6 weeks. Cash purchases, no negotiation, final price, take it or leave it. 2 families had already taken it. The Hollis brothers were considering. She heard this through the kitchen window, which she'd propped open to get airflow while she had the stove open for cleaning. She hadn't intended to listen, but she listened. "Vale's looking west," Pete said. "Your land is between him and the river." "I know where my land is," Caleb said. "Just saying, man's moving fast." "I'm not selling. Didn't say you were, just... He's going to come by. Probably soon. Wanted you to know." She heard the scrape of chairs, then Pete's voice, lower, less careful. "Caleb, you hired a woman, and she's got kids. I know what I hired. The boys in town are going to..." "Pete," a pause. "It's not your concern." Another pause. Then boots on the floor and the front door opening and closing. She stayed very still by the window until she heard the horses leave. Then she went back to what she was doing. Marcus Vale arrived on a Thursday. She knew who he was before Caleb said anything because of the horse. A big gray with good bone and better tack, the kind of animal that said its owner had money and wanted the world to know it. The man matched the horse. He was perhaps 50, square-jawed, unhurried, dressed for weather, but not for work. The kind of man who told other men what to do and never learned to do things himself. He looked at Eliza the way Pete Harlow had looked at her, except worse, because Pete Harlow's dismissal was casual. Vale's was deliberate. He turned away from her before she finished crossing the yard. "Mercer." He shook Caleb's hand. "It's been a while." "What brings you out, Marcus?" "Neighborly visit." He looked around the yard with an expression of polite appraisal, which was actually not polite at all, but rather the look of a man calculating what things were worth. "Place is looking. Managed. Barely." "She's managing fine." Vale glanced back at Eliza. "She fixed the chimney I heard about?" Bert from the feed store mentioned a woman climbing around on your roof. The chimney works now. Caleb. Vale lowered his voice in the way people do when they want you to know they're being kind, but also want anyone nearby to hear them being kind. I don't mean any disrespect, but you've got a widow and 2 children running your winter operation. The snow hasn't even started yet. Eliza kept walking toward the barn like she hadn't heard. She had heard every word. Inside the barn, she stood in the half-dark and breathed and took stock of what she was feeling so she didn't have to carry it around. Anger, yes. The particular kind of anger that came from being assessed and dismissed by someone who didn't know her and wasn't interested in knowing her. She'd felt it before. At every ranch she'd tried before this one, in every room where men had looked at her handcart and her children and decided she was a problem rather than a solution. She was used to it. That didn't mean she had to be easy with it. She went to the far end of the barn where she'd been meaning to look at the water line connection and crouched down to check the joint she'd suspected was failing. It was a slow seep that would become a split when the hard freeze hit. She'd need to fix it before that happened. She pulled out her notebook and wrote it down. Outside, she could hear the low murmur of Vale's voice. He was still talking. Men like that always had more to say. That evening, after supper, Caleb sat at the table longer than usual. He had his coffee, and he was looking at nothing. Eliza washed the pots and waited. "You heard what Vale said," he said finally. "Some of it. He's going to make an offer, probably a fair one on paper. Are you going to take it?" He turned his cup around in his hands. "My wife and I built this place. Took us 12 years to get the land stable. She died 7 years ago." A pause. "I've been fighting this place ever since. Some days I wonder if I'm just holding on because I don't know what else to do." Eliza set down the pot. "Is that why you hired me?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You hired me because you needed someone to cook. That's what you said. But I think you hired me because the ranch needed someone who still believed it was worth saving." He was quiet. "It is worth saving," she said. "The bones of this place are good. The water line in the barn needs fixing. The east hay bales in the loft are stacked against an outside wall, and they'll get moisture in them through the winter if we don't move them. The paddock fence is done. The chimney works. And I've been looking at the northwest ridge line. The way the wind comes down that slope in winter is going to batter the barn if we don't put up some kind of break." He stared at her. "How do you know about windbreaks?" "My father had a farm in Kansas. He lost 2 barns before a neighbor told him what to do about the northwest wind. After that, he never lost another one." "You were a farmer's daughter. And then a rancher's wife, and then neither." She picked the pot back up. "The water line in the barn is going to split in the first hard freeze if we don't fix it. We have maybe 2 weeks before that happens." Caleb looked at his coffee. "You want to fix it?" he said. "I want to fix everything," she said, not making it dramatic, just saying it like it was true because it was. "Starting with what will fail first." He said nothing for a moment, then, "There's copper fittings in the cellar from 2 years ago. I bought them thinking I'd get around to it. I'll find them in the morning." She finished the dishes. He sat there while she worked, not talking, which was fine. She wasn't looking for conversation. She was already thinking about the hay bales and the ridge line and the water line and the 12 other things she'd noticed in the last 4 days and hadn't said yet. She thought about them in the order they would kill the ranch if left alone. She put the first one at the top of the list. Then she went to check on the children. Eli was awake. He was lying on his back on the narrow cot with his eyes on the ceiling, and he didn't pretend to be asleep when she came in, which she appreciated. "You okay?" she said. "Yeah." She sat on the edge of the cot. Clara was curled against the wall, genuinely asleep, her breath small and even. "What do you think of this place?" Eliza said. Eli considered this with more seriousness than most adults brought to important questions. "The barn is good," he said. "Solid construction. Old, but solid." "It is." "The fence you fixed today, I watched. You didn't cut the rails long enough on the first one." She blinked. "I cut them to measure. The post was bowed. Not much, but enough. When the ground shifts in spring, it's going to pull that rail loose." He paused. "Maybe not first winter, but it will." She looked at him. I didn't say anything because you were working, he said, which was the most diplomatically devastating sentence she'd heard in months. You can say things, she told him. When you notice something, you can say it. Even to the rancher? Even to the rancher, just respectfully. He nodded, processing this. Is he going to let us stay? I don't know yet. Do you like it here? She thought about the smoke-stained ceiling and the leaking water line and the wind coming down the northwest ridgeline and the look on Marcus Vale's face when he turned away from her like she wasn't there. I think it has potential, she said. Eli nodded again, satisfied. He turned on his side and closed his eyes. She sat there a little longer, listening to the wind outside, feeling the house around her. The solid walls, the fixed chimney pulling clean now, the gap under the back door that no longer bled cold air. Small things. First things. The house wasn't saved. Not even close. But it was slightly less likely to fail tonight than it had been when she arrived. And that was the only direction that mattered. She went to bed. She didn't sleep well. She never did. But she slept enough to be useful in the morning, and that was what she'd learned to aim for. What she hadn't told Caleb, what she hadn't told anyone, was that she'd been watching the sky every morning since they arrived. There were things her father had shown her. The particular way the clouds banked in certain formations, the color of the sky before a major system moved in, the way the air smelled different days before a storm that most people wouldn't feel until it was already on top of them. The sky to the northwest that morning had been the color of an old bruise. She'd noticed it on the roof. She hadn't said anything yet because she wasn't sure. She needed a few more days of watching, but she had a growing feeling, the kind that settled in the chest and didn't move, that this winter was not going to be ordinary, and that whatever was coming down from the northwest was going to test everything she knew about keeping people safe in a bad season. She lay in the dark and ran through the list again. Waterline, hay bales, windbreak, roof junction on the east barn wall, the cellar door latch that didn't seal, the feed store count, and whether they had enough to carry through a hard winter or just a mild one. She fell asleep somewhere in the middle of the inventory. In the morning, she got up and started fixing things. That was the only answer she had. It had always been enough. The copper fittings were exactly where Caleb said they'd be. Bottom shelf of the cellar, behind a crate of old hinges and a rusted handsaw that hadn't been touched in years. Eliza pulled them out one by one, checked each fitting against the joint dimensions she'd measured in the barn, and found 3 that would work. The 4th she'd need to improvise. She didn't mind improvising. She'd been doing it her whole life. The cellar itself told her things. The way provisions were stored, some careful, some careless, no real system, said that whoever had been managing this place had good instincts and bad follow-through. There were things stored correctly from years ago, and things thrown in recently with no thought. The line between those 2 eras was easy to read. It was the line between before Caleb's wife died and after. She brought the fittings up and went to the barn. The water line ran along the interior west wall, about 18 inches off the ground, a simple iron pipe with 2 joints that connected to the trough system. The seeping joint was the second one, near the corner where the wall met the floor. She could see the pale mineral stain spreading from it where water had been slowly escaping for weeks, maybe longer. She pressed her fingers against the joint. Cold, damp, the pipe slightly loose in its bracket. "What are you doing?" She turned. Eli was standing in the barn doorway with his hands in his pockets and his breath making small clouds in the air. "Waterline's failing," she said. "Come look." He crossed the barn and crouched beside her. She showed him the stain, showed him where the fitting had loosened, showed him how the bracket had pulled slightly away from the wall because the timber it was anchored to had a slow twist in it from years of seasonal movement. "The bracket's the real problem," Eli said. "Yes." "So even if you fix the fitting, the bracket pulls it loose again eventually, so I fix both." She stood and looked at the wall. "I need to move the bracket 2 inches to the left, into solid timber, then refit the joint with the new fittings and pack the connection properly." Eli studied the wall. "The timber 2 inches left is solid. I can see the grain." She looked at him. "I've been looking at the barn," he said, with a small shrug that tried to be casual and didn't quite get there. She handed him the spare fitting. "Hold these." They worked through the morning. Eliza with the tools, Eli passing things and holding things and occasionally pointing out something she'd missed or was about to do in the wrong order. He was right twice. She didn't make a production of it. She just adjusted and kept working. And he seemed to understand that was the only acknowledgement she had to offer right now, and it was enough. When the joint was done and the bracket reset, she opened the line slowly, and they both watched. Nothing dripped. "Good," Eli said. "For now. We'll check it again tonight and tomorrow morning." He nodded and handed back the unused fitting without being asked. They walked back to the house. The sky to the northwest had the same color it had every morning. That flat, waiting gray that pressed down on the horizon like something holding its breath. She watched it for a moment. "Mama," Eli said. "I see it." "Is it?" "I don't know yet." He didn't ask again. Word traveled faster in this valley than it had any right to. By the end of that first week, Eliza had fixed the water line, moved the hay bales in the east loft away from the exterior wall, repaired 2 of the cellar doors' 3 hinges, and spent an afternoon studying the northwest ridge line from every angle she could manage. On foot, from the barn roof, from the small rise behind the house, trying to understand how the wind came down that slope in a hard storm. It came fast and it came low. She could see the evidence in the bent grass, in the way the fence posts on the northwest side leaned slightly east, and the old damage on the corner of the barn that had been patched and repatched over the years. The wind hit that corner first and hardest. Whatever had been tried before hadn't been enough. She was still thinking about it when Caleb found her standing on the ridge with her notebook. "People are talking," he said, climbing up the slope on his cane with the careful economy of movement that told her his leg hurt more than he admitted. "About me?" "About a woman doing fence work and climbing on rooftops." He stopped beside her and looked out at the ridgeline. "Bert at the feed store told half the county. Pete Harlow told the other half." "Does it bother you?" He was quiet a moment. "Depends on what they're saying." "What are they saying?" "Half think I've lost my mind." A pause. "Other half are waiting to see what happens." She wrote something in her notebook. "Let them wait." He looked at what she was writing. She turned the notebook so he could see. A rough sketch of the ridgeline with wind direction marked, the barn position, and a proposed line of posts and brush that would break the worst of the northwest wind before it hit the structure. "Windbreak," he said. "Your neighbor 2 hills over has one on his east side. I saw it when we rode out to check the fence markers last week. His barn wall is clean, no weather damage. Yours has been patched 4 times. Caleb studied the sketch. "That's going to take lumber and time." "I know. It can be done in stages, first section before the snow, the rest in spring." He handed the notebook back without agreeing or disagreeing, which she'd learned was how he processed things. He needed to hold an idea for a day or 2 before he could commit to it. She didn't push. "Dorian's coming," he said. She looked at him. "My nephew. He was supposed to come in September. He's been delayed." Caleb's voice was flat in the way that meant there was something underneath it he wasn't saying. "He'll be here by end of the month." "Is that a problem?" "He has, ideas about the ranch." Another pause. "He's had ideas since he was 19. None of them have worked out, but he keeps having them." She closed her notebook. "What kind of ideas?" "He thinks the land would do better broken up and sold in sections. Thinks cattle is dying business and the railroad's going to change everything." Caleb started back down the slope. "He might not be wrong about the railroad. He's wrong about the rest." She watched him go, thinking about the word temporary. Dorian's arrival was going to reframe everything she'd built here in 2 weeks. She could see that already. She looked out at the ridgeline one more time, then she went back to work. The morning Pete Harlow's youngest boy rode over to borrow a length of rope, or said that was why he came, though she suspected he'd been sent to see what was actually happening at Blackthorn Ridge. Eliza was up on the roof of the smokehouse replacing a section of flashing that had lifted in a windstorm 2 weeks before she arrived. The boy, maybe 14, sat on his horse and watched her with open amazement. "You're on the roof," he said. "Good observation. My pa said you'd been fixing things." "Your pa was right." He didn't say you'd be on the smokehouse roof. She drove a nail. Where's he think I'd be? The boy thought about this. Kitchen, I guess. I do that too. She set another nail. Ropes in the barn, south wall, second hook. Take what you need and leave the rest. He didn't move immediately. Can I ask you something? She paused and looked down at him. He had a red face and the serious expression of someone trying to decide if they were being rude. Go ahead. How do you know how to do all this? She drove the last nail in that section. I learned. Who taught you? She thought about her father, about watching him rebuild after the second barn went down, about how she'd been maybe 12 and she'd handed him tools and he'd explained everything as he went. Not because he thought she'd need it, but because he thought out loud and she happened to be there. She thought about her husband, who'd been a careful man, methodical, and who'd let her help with everything because they didn't have the money to turn down capable hands, and how she'd learned what he knew by working beside him for 11 years. Different people, she said, at different times. I paid attention. The boy nodded slowly. Then he went to the barn to find the rope. She watched him go and thought about paying attention, about how it was the cheapest education available and the most reliable, and how most people never did it because they were too busy waiting to be taught by someone who told them they were ready. Nobody had ever told her she was ready. She'd just started doing things. Caleb didn't say it directly, but she could tell the changing community talk was getting under his skin in a different way than he let on. One evening, he came in from the paddock with a look that was somewhere between proud and annoyed, and he sat down to dinner and said without preamble, Ed Garvey rode over today. Wanted to know how I fixed the chimney. Eliza set a plate in front of him. What did you tell him? Told him Mrs. Vane handled it. What did he say? Caleb picked up his fork. He said he didn't know widows knew about chimneys. What did you say to that? Nothing. Thought about it, though. He started eating. After a moment, he's got a smoking chimney. His wife has been after him about it since summer. Eliza sat down with her own plate. Would he let me look at it? Caleb looked up. You want to fix Ed Garvey's chimney? If it needs fixing and he'll let me, yes. Why? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because if the only people who have seen what I can do are you and the Harlow boy who came for rope, then when something hard happens here, we're going to be standing alone. But if Ed Garvey's wife can sleep warmer this winter because of what I did, Ed Garvey's going to remember that. Caleb set his fork down and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was the look of someone recalibrating. That's a long way of thinking, he said. Winter's a long time. He picked up his fork again. I'll ride over tomorrow and ask him. She nodded and went back to eating. Across the table, Clara was moving her beans around her plate in what was clearly a non-eating strategy, and Eliza said her name quietly, and Clara looked up and started actually eating. Eli, for his part, had been looking at Caleb with the careful attention he brought to everything he observed. Caleb caught it. What? Caleb said. Nothing, Eli said. You've been looking at me like that for 2 minutes. Eli considered this. The post on the south side of the paddock, second from the corner. It's going to go in the next hard freeze. Ground's heaved around it. You can see it if you look. Caleb blinked. Eli, Eliza said. You said I could say things, he told her. Respectfully. I was being respectful. Caleb made a sound that, after a moment, she realized was something close to a laugh. It was brief and somewhat rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while. He reached for his coffee. I'll look at the post tomorrow, he said. Yeah. She went to fix Ed Garvey's chimney on a Tuesday, with Eli beside her to hold rope and hand up tools, and Clara at Blackthorn Ridge with Caleb, which Clara accepted with the diplomatic resignation of someone who had learned that arguing about these things was a waste of energy. The Garvey place was 4 miles south. Ruth Garvey met her at the door with the expression of a woman who had stopped expecting good news but hadn't given up entirely. She was maybe 50, compact, with quick eyes and flour on her apron. Caleb Mercer said you'd come, Ruth said. I told Ed not to get his hopes up. The chimney's been backing up since when? Eliza said. September, maybe August. Hard to tell. It was gradual. Ruth stepped back. Come in. Ed's in the barn. The chimney problem at the Garvey house was different from Caleb's. No nest blockage, but a cracked damper plate that wasn't sealing properly and was letting cold air down the flue even when the damper was open, creating a pressure problem that pushed smoke back into the room. A subtler issue than a blocked chimney, but fixable. She told Ruth what she'd found and what she'd need to fix it. Ruth looked at her steadily. You know this how? I've looked at a lot of chimneys. You're a young woman. I'm 34, Eliza said. I've been looking at chimneys since I was 12. Ruth was quiet a moment. Ed's not going to let a woman up on his roof. Does Ed want a chimney that works? Another pause. He wants what he always wants, Ruth said, which didn't quite answer the question, but answered something else entirely. Then, I'll talk to him. Ed Garvey was in his 50s, solid, with the suspicious patience of a man who'd been told a lot of things that hadn't worked out. He stood in his yard and watched Eliza explain what was wrong with his chimney with the expression of someone waiting to catch her in a mistake. She didn't give him one. She explained the damper plate, the pressure differential, the cold air column in the flue, the way you could test it with a lit match held near the firebox opening to see which way the air was moving. She told him what the repair would take and how long it would hold and what to watch for afterward. Ed listened to all of it. Then he said, How much? Nothing, she said. I'm doing this because it needs doing. He didn't know what to do with that. She could see him trying to find the catch. Why? He said finally. Because your neighbor Caleb Mercer has been fighting to keep his ranch alive for 7 years, and he needs people in this valley who know his operation is worth knowing. And fixing your chimney is the straightest line between here and there. Ed was quiet long enough that Ruth, standing in the doorway, said his name in the specific tone that meant, answer the woman. All right, Ed said. She went up on his roof. Kid. The repair took most of the afternoon. By the time she came down, a small thing had happened that she hadn't planned for. 3 other men had appeared in Ed Garvey's yard. She didn't know how word spread that fast, smoke signals, she figured, or the particular frontier telegraph of bored men who watched each other's properties from a distance. But there they were. Harlan Coop from down the creek, fat with a vest he hadn't buttoned since probably 1882. Young Thomas Riggs, who ran the easternmost property on the valley floor. And Pete Harlow, who apparently went everywhere. They stood at a careful distance and watched her come down the ladder. Pete said, She actually fixed it? Ask the chimney, Eliza said, and walked to the pump to wash her hands. Ruth Garvey went inside and lit the hearth. Everyone stood around waiting. Smoke went up the chimney and stayed there. The room, Ruth called from inside, was already warming. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Harlan Coop said, My water trough's been freezing early. Cracked it twice last winter. She dried her hands. That's usually an insulation problem. What's it sitting on? Bare ground. There's your answer. Raise it 3 inches on timber rails and pack straw underneath. Ground cold conducts up through the legs. Give it some separation and you lose half your early freeze problem. Harlan looked at Pete. Pete looked at Thomas Riggs. Thomas Riggs looked at the ground. I could come look at it, she said. If you want. Harlan thought about it for about 4 seconds. When? Thursday, if the weather holds. That evening, riding back to Blackthorn Ridge with Eli beside her on the wagon bench, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not triumph, it wasn't big enough for that. And anyway, she'd learned that triumph was usually temporary and was best not leaned on. But something quieter, the sense of being useful in a way that was starting to connect to something larger than her own immediate survival. You made friends today, Eli said. I fixed a chimney. Same thing, he said, and shrugged in the way he did when he thought he was being obvious. She looked at him sideways. When did you get smart? I've always been smart, he said. You were just tired before. She didn't argue with that. Well, Dorian Mercer arrived on a Friday at noon, which meant he came when the sun was high and visibility was good, which she suspected was not accidental. Men who thought in terms of entrances and impressions tended to time their arrivals for the best light. He was 32 or 33, lean, dressed well for the territory, not ostentatiously, but carefully. His horse was good, but not as good as Marcus Vale's. He had Caleb's eyes, the same deep-set gray, But where Caleb's eyes calculated quietly, Dorian's eyes calculated openly, as if he wanted you to know you were being assessed. He looked at Eliza the moment he rode into the yard. Not past her like Vale had, directly at her, which was almost worse because the directness wasn't respect. It was a different kind of appraisal. The kind that was sizing up an obstacle. "You must be the woman Caleb hired," he said. "Eliza Vane." "Dorian Mercer." He didn't offer his hand. "Where's my uncle?" "Inside, he's been waiting for you since Wednesday." Dorian tied his horse and walked toward the house without responding to that. She watched him go. Inside, she could hear the greeting, the backslapping, the voice modulations of men performing family feeling they weren't entirely sure they had anymore. She went back to what she was doing, which was replacing the cracked bottom board on the root cellar stairs. Not glamorous work, but the board had a lip that caught, and she'd watched Caleb nearly go down on it twice. 20 minutes later, Dorian came back outside. "Mrs. Vane." She was on her knees with a pry bar and didn't get up. "Yes." "What exactly are you doing?" "Replacing the cellar stair board. It's a trip hazard." He crouched to look at it. Up close, she could see he was someone who'd never done work like this himself, but who had enough intelligence to assess it. The particular look of a man who valued competence in others because he'd never acquired it himself. "Caleb says you've been doing repairs around the property." "The property needed repairs." "You were hired to cook." "I've been cooking. The repairs needed doing, and I was the one who could do them, so I did them." She set the pry bar and pulled the old board loose. "If that's a problem for you, you'll want to take it up with your uncle." Dorian was quiet for a moment. "I've been looking at the books," he said, in a tone that suggested this was the real conversation they were having. "The ranch is losing ground. Financially. The cattle numbers are down. The hay yield was poor last season. The debt to the bank is—" "I know about the debt," she said. He blinked. "Caleb told you." "He didn't have to. I can read a supply ledger, and I've been managing provisions here for 3 weeks. I know what it costs to run this place, and I can see what it's producing. They're not matching up." Dorian stood up. She could feel him rearranging something in his thinking, not abandoning his position, but adjusting his approach. She recognized the move. "This ranch needs capital investment. It can't generate internally," he said. "There are buyers who'd pay well for the land. My uncle could live comfortably. Better than—" He gestured at the yard with a small motion that managed to be dismissive without being specific. "Better than this," she said. "Better than fighting a losing battle." She lifted the new board into position and tested the fit. "Your uncle's not fighting a losing battle," she said. "He's been fighting alone. Those are different things." "And you're the solution?" She didn't look up. "I'm part of one. The chimney works. The water line is fixed. The hay in the east loft will be dry by midwinter. I've done the water trough on 2 neighboring properties, and I've got 3 more asking. Every person I help is someone who'll notice if this ranch stands or falls." She pressed the board down and reached for a nail. "You want to sell this land to Marcus Vale? You go ahead and make that case to Caleb. But don't expect me to help you do it." The silence afterward was long enough that she looked up. Dorian was watching her with an expression that wasn't anger. It was the more dangerous thing. Interest. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Nobody ever is," she said. "Hand me that nail set." He looked at the nail set lying on the ground beside his boot. He picked it up and handed it to her. She went back to work. He stood there a moment longer, then went back inside. She heard his footsteps on the porch, and then nothing. The board fit well. She tested it 3 times with her foot before she was satisfied. The lip was gone. Caleb could use those stairs without risking his leg, which was the whole point. She moved on to the next thing on her list. It was Caleb who told her what Dorian said that night, which surprised her. He wasn't a man who repeated conversations. But he came into the kitchen while she was sorting seed stock she'd found in the cellar, checking viability, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. "Dorian says you're managing the ranch." "I'm doing repairs," she said. "He says you spoke about the finances." "He brought them up. I didn't go looking for that conversation." Caleb came in and sat at the table. He looked tired. Not the tired of physical work, which she recognized on him as something he carried well, but the tired of people and the particular exhaustion of family who came with their own agendas dressed up as concern. "He's not wrong about the debt," Caleb said. "I know. The bank's been patient because this land has value, but patience has an end." She looked up from the seeds. "What would you need to clear enough in spring to make the bank comfortable?" "More than last year's cattle numbers are going to produce." "What if the cattle numbers were better?" He looked at her. "3 of the calves born late are still in the main barn," she said. "I've been watching them. 2 of them should be in the smaller paddock. They're stronger than you're treating them. Separating them and moving to 2-stage feed will put weight on them faster. By spring, you'd have an extra, maybe 200 pounds between them." Caleb stared at her. "I grew up around cattle," she said. "I'm not guessing." He was quiet a long time. Then, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I was still learning the operation," she said. "I'm saying it now." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she'd seen a few times, always when he was processing something that had changed the way he was looking at a situation. "You're not just a cook," he said. It came out somewhere between an accusation and a statement of fact. "I never said I was just a cook," she said. "You said it." He looked at her steadily. "I told you when I arrived," she said. "I told you I could do whatever needed doing." "You did," he said. Outside, the wind picked up, pressing against the west wall of the house. The fire in the hearth pulled strong and clean, the chimney doing its job, holding fast against whatever was out there. Caleb listened to the wind. She could see him listening to it. "The northwest ridgeline," he said. "What about it?" "You want to start the windbreak." She set down the seeds. "Yes." "How much timber?" 15 posts, 40 feet of horizontal rail, staggered, and I want to plant brush on the outside of the rail line, the kind that grows dense. It'll take 2 winters to really establish, but it starts working the first season." He was quiet. "You have the timber," she said. "I counted it last week. You have enough for the first section without buying more." "You counted my timber." "I count everything," she said. "It's how I know what we have to work with." He made the sound again, Betum, that brief rusty thing that wasn't quite a laugh. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark. "First hard frost is maybe 10 days off," he said. 8, she said. "Maybe less." He turned and looked at her. "The sky's been telling me since the second morning I was here," she said. "I didn't want to say until I was certain. Are you certain now?" She thought about the sky's color that morning, the same bruised northwest horizon, the way the air had that stillness in it that came right before a system moved in from the high country. "Yes," she said. Caleb's jaw tightened, not with fear, with the recognition of a man who'd been in this country long enough to know what certainty about weather meant. "Then we start the windbreak tomorrow," he said. "I'll have Eli help me mark the post line at first light." He nodded. Then he said, "Dorian's going to fight this." "I know." "He's going to say we're throwing money at a dying operation." "He might say that," she said, "but the windbreak's going to be there either way. And when the storm comes, it's going to matter." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the short, final kind that meant the decision was made, and he went to bed. She sat at the table for a while longer, the seeds spread in front of her, the fire burning clean and steady behind her. Outside, the wind kept coming. She let it come. They started the windbreak at first light. The ground was hard but not yet frozen solid. She had maybe a week before driving posts would require more force than they had available, and she wasn't going to waste the window. She'd marked the line the night before with stakes and twine, walking it out herself in the dark with a lantern, adjusting twice when the angle wasn't right. The line had to intercept the wind coming down the northwest slope before it hit the barn corner. Too far east and it would deflect wrong. Too close to the barn and it wouldn't have room to work. She'd measured it 4 times. Eli was up before she called him. He was already in the yard when she came out, checking the twine line in the early gray light, crouching to look along it the way she'd shown him, eye to the ground, checking for true. "It's off on the far end," he said, "about 2 inches." She walked to the far stake and looked. He was right. She adjusted the stake without comment, and they both looked along the line again. "Better," he said. Caleb came out 20 minutes later, moving slowly in the cold, his leg worse in low temperatures. She'd noticed that and hadn't mentioned it. Some things didn't need to be said. He looked at the staked line, looked at the barn, looked at the ridge line above. "Post spacing," he said. 7 feet center to center. Tight enough to break turbulence, wide enough that we can manage them. He nodded. "You want me to help drive posts. I want you to tell me if I've got the line right." He walked the line. He took his time. She watched him read the landscape the way a man reads something he's known for 40 years, looking for things she might have missed. "Move the third marker 6 inches north," he said. She moved it. He looked again, nodded. That was enough. They drove posts for 3 hours. Caleb worked the heavy post driver from the ground. He couldn't manage the ladder work, but he could set the driver and had more power in his upper body than men half his age. And Eliza guided and Eli held posts plumb while they sank. It was slow, ugly work. 2 posts went crooked and had to be pulled and reset. One split at the top when the driver hit a stress fault in the timber and she had to swap it for another from the stack. By noon, they had 7 posts in. By mid-afternoon, they had 12. Dorian came out at 3 o'clock and stood at the edge of the yard with his arms crossed and watched. She kept working. "You're burning a day," he said finally. "Driving posts," she said. "I can see what you're doing. I'm saying it's a day's labor on something that may not matter if the operation can't sustain itself through spring." Caleb stopped driving and looked at his nephew. The look was not warm. "Go inside, Dorian." "Uncle, I'm working." Caleb lifted the driver again. "Go inside." Dorian stood there another moment. Then he went. She heard the porch door close harder than it needed to. Caleb drove the post. Neither of them mentioned it. 3 days after the windbreak was started, Marcus Vale came back. He didn't come alone this time. He brought a man with him, younger, in a suit that had no business being in a Wyoming yard carrying a leather document case. A lawyer, or someone playing the part. The document case was the kind of prop that was meant to make things feel formal and final before they were either. Eliza was splitting wood when they rode in. She kept splitting. Vale glanced at her and dismissed her in the same motion, and she filed that away. Caleb came out onto the porch. "Marcus," he said. It wasn't a welcome. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a man being careful. "Caleb, I want you to meet Edmund Price. He handles my property interests." Price was 40, thin, with eyes that moved fast over everything and settled on nothing for long. He nodded at Caleb with the precision of someone who'd been trained to communicate respect without actually feeling it. "Mr. Mercer," Price said, "I have some materials I'd like to show you." "I'm not buying anything," Caleb said. "We're not selling," Vale said. "We're offering." He looked around the yard with the same calculating appraisal he'd brought the first time. His eyes landed on the windbreak posts, still unrailed, standing raw against the sky. "You're doing construction." "Windbreak," Caleb said, "in November." "That's when it needs to be done." Vale looked at Price. Price looked at the document case. The wordless conversation between them was brief and contained everything Eliza needed to know about how this meeting was going to go. She set her axe down and walked toward the porch. Vale turned. This time, he didn't look through her. He looked at her with the deliberate attention of someone identifying a problem. "Mrs. Vane," he said. "Mr. Vale, you've been keeping busy, I hear. Chimneys, water troughs, now a windbreak." He said it pleasantly, the way people say things that are not pleasant. "You've made quite an impression on the valley." "I've been doing work that needed doing." He turned back to Caleb. "I have an offer prepared. It's fair, more than fair. The land value is assessed at—" "I know what my land is worth," Caleb said. "Then you know what I'm offering exceeds it." "I'm not selling." Vale's expression didn't change in any obvious way, but something behind his eyes went harder. She could see it. The adjustment that men like him made when they stopped pretending and started deciding how much force to apply. "Caleb," Vale said, quieter now, "you have a debt with the Rollins Bank. I know the terms. I know the timeline." He paused. I also know that the bank's regional manager is a man I've done considerable business with. If this ranch goes to foreclosure, the land comes to market. I'll buy it then. But the price I'm offering you now is better than what you'd see from a bank sale, and you'd have something to show for it. Another pause. If you wait and lose it, you'll have nothing. The yard went very quiet. Caleb's hands tightened on his cane. Eliza looked at Price, who was looking at his document case with the carefully neutral expression of a man who'd heard this speech before and had learned not to react to it. That sounds like a threat, Caleb said. His voice was steady. She respected that. It's an observation, Vale said. The difference between a threat and an observation is what you decide to do with the information. She'd had enough. Mr. Vale, she said. He turned to her. There was a flicker of something. Not quite surprised that she'd spoken, but irritation that she'd made him turn. What does the bank's debt timeline look like against a strong spring cattle sale? She said. Not last year's numbers. The year before, when the operation was running properly. What does that comparison look like? Vale blinked. I'm asking, she said, because you've framed this as inevitable. I'm wondering whether you've run the numbers or whether you're assuming Mr. Mercer hasn't. Price cleared his throat. Vale looked at her for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible now, which meant he'd decided she mattered enough to calculate against. The spring sale would need to exceed last year's by 30% to make meaningful headway against the debt, Vale said. And what if it did? It won't. Why not? Because this operation is understaffed and has been mismanaged she said. Was understaffed. Was mismanaged. What it is right now is different from what it was in October. She kept her voice even. The chimney is fixed. The water line is fixed. The hay in the east loft is properly stored for the first time in what I'm guessing is 3 seasons. The windbreak goes up this week. 2 of the late calves are on a 2-stage feed that will put 200 pounds between them by spring. And I've had conversations with 4 neighboring operations in the last 2 weeks about winter management, which means Blackthorn Ridge is going into winter with more goodwill in this valley than it's had in years. Vale stared at her. You're a cook, he said. I'm what the ranch needed, she said. And you came here today because you've heard enough about what I've been doing to know this property isn't as easy to acquire as it was in October. She looked at him steadily. Come back in spring with your offer, Mr. Vale. See where things stand then. The silence stretched. Price closed the document case. It was the smallest movement, but it meant something. Vale looked at Caleb. Your cook is very confident, he said. She usually is, Caleb said. She's usually right. Vale held Caleb's gaze for another moment. Then he nodded. The short, controlled nod of a man marking a position he intends to return to, and he and Price walked back to their horses. She stood on the porch and watched them ride out. When the sound of hooves faded, Caleb said, That was a risk. Yes. If we don't make spring numbers, I know. He looked at her. Do you believe what you said? She'd been asking herself that since the words left her mouth. The calves, the hay, the windbreak, the goodwill, those were real. The spring numbers were a projection. Projections could fail. I believe it's possible, she said, and I believe that if you'd signed that paper today, possible would have become impossible. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Get the posts railed, he said. I want that windbreak done by the end of the week. She went back to the woodpile. The sky changed on a Wednesday. She'd been watching it every morning and every evening, tracking the color and the cloud formations and the way the air moved down from the high country. And on Wednesday morning, she walked out to the yard before full light and looked northwest and felt something drop in her stomach. The horizon was gone, not with fog, with cloud cover that had come down low in the night, the kind that didn't have the soft edge of normal storm systems, but a flat, pressing density that meant something much larger was stacking up behind it. The air had that particular stillness that came before significant weather. Not calm, but held, like everything was waiting. She stood in the yard for a long time. Then she went inside and made breakfast and didn't say anything through the meal, but she was thinking hard. After the children left for their morning chores, she said to Caleb, The storm is closer than I thought. He looked up from his coffee. Maybe 4 days, she said. Maybe less. I don't think it's a normal winter storm. He set down his cup. How big? I don't know. Big enough that I want to change how we're thinking about preparation. Caleb's jaw set. What do you need? She pulled out her notebook and set it on the table. She'd been writing the list since 3 in the morning when she'd woken and looked at the black window and understood that the thing pressing against the northwest horizon was not a system she'd seen before. Not here, not in Kansas, not anywhere she'd weathered a winter. Emergency paths between buildings, she said. Rope lines, fixed anchor to anchor so we can navigate in whiteout. Livestock water heated and stored inside in case the line freezes despite the repair. Hay moved to the closest interior storage. I want it reachable from the barn without going outside if possible. The smokehouse needs to be fully loaded before it hits. The cellar door needs a second latch because if the wind gets under it, we lose the whole cellar to cold air. Caleb listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously. That's 3 days of work, he said. We have 4, maybe. Dorian's not going to help willingly. I know. She paused. Tell him the roof might come off the barn if we don't prepare it. Tell him whatever gets him working. I don't care about his feelings right now. Caleb looked at her. A faint thing crossed his face, something that might have been appreciation or might have been the recognition of someone who'd just said out loud what he'd been thinking. I'll talk to him, Caleb said. He pushed back from the table and went to find his nephew. She went to the barn to start moving hay. So Dorian did not help willingly, but he helped. She wasn't sure whether Caleb had told him about the roof or threatened him with something else, but by mid-morning Dorian was in the barn in his good coat, which, she thought privately, was going to be ruined, helping shift hay bales from the east loft to the interior ground floor storage. He worked with the expression of a man who'd decided that cooperating was more strategic than refusing, which was fine. She didn't need him to believe in the storm. She needed him to move hay. He was stronger than she'd expected. He worked without complaint, which was more than she'd anticipated. Around noon he came to where she was anchoring the first rope line between the house and the barn and stood watching her for a moment. You think it's going to be that bad? He said. I think it could be. Could be, he repeated. You're preparing for something that might not happen. I'm preparing for what the sky is telling me. She drove the anchor stake with 3 solid strikes. If the storm is mild, we spent 3 days doing work that needed doing anyway. If it's not mild, we survived because we did it. He was quiet for a moment. My uncle trusts your weather reading. He should. He's seen enough Wyoming winters to know what the sky looks like before a bad one. And what does it look like? She looked northwest. The cloud cover had lowered another degree since morning. The color had gone from bruised gray to something darker, with a greenish undertone that she'd never liked. The air was perfectly still. It looks like it's not finished building yet, she said, and that's the part that worries me. Dorian looked at the horizon. She watched him look, watched the calculation in his eyes slow down and become something more instinctive. What do you need me to do? He said. The cellar door latch. There's hardware in the barn, second shelf from the right. I need a second throw bolt mounted on the inside frame, low, so even in a hard blow, if someone has to go in from outside, they can get the bolt set fast before the wind catches the door. He nodded and went. She moved to the next anchor point. She told the children that evening. Clara was 9 years old, had turned 9 the week before Eliza arrived at Blackthorn Ridge, and she had the particular composure of a child who'd been through enough difficult things to know that composure was more useful than panic, but who also had a child's inability to fully understand what she was composing herself about. Eli was 10, and he already knew. She could see it in the way he'd been working all day without needing direction, carrying and moving and securing things with the focused quiet of someone who'd understood the situation before she'd said it aloud. She sat them down in the small room after supper. There's a storm coming, she said, a big one. Maybe the biggest one this area's seen in a long time. We don't know for certain, but we're preparing like it is, because that's the smart thing to do. Clara said, How big? Big enough that we're stringing rope between the buildings so we don't get lost if we have to go outside in the dark. Clara absorbed this with a careful expression. Will we be safe? We're going to do everything we can to be safe, Eliza said, and there are things I need you to do. Okay, Clara said. Her voice was steady. Eliza felt something difficult move through her at the sound of it. Her daughter's steadiness, earned through no fault of her own. She told them both, "Stay inside unless they were with an adult. Know the rope line, but don't use it alone. Know where the candles were and the matches and the spare blankets. Know the sound she was going to use if she needed them to come fast." 3 sharp knocks on whatever surface was between them. Eli listened and asked 2 questions, both practical, both good. She answered them. Clara listened and said, "What about the calves?" "What about them?" "The 2 in the small paddock. You moved them out there for the better feed. They're not connected to the barn by a covered run." Eliza looked at her daughter. "If the storm is as big as you think," Clara said, "they're going to be exposed." She'd known this. She'd had it on her list and hadn't gotten to it. She looked at Eli. "We need to move them back to the main barn tomorrow," he said. "First thing." "First thing," she agreed. Clara sat back, satisfied. That night, Eliza walked the property alone after the others were in bed. She walked the rope line she'd strung between the house and the barn, tested each anchor, tested the rope tension, walked it 3 times until she could do it without looking at the rope at all. She walked the path between the barn and the smokehouse. She stood at the cellar door and tested the new bolt Dorian had installed. Solid, properly placed, exactly right. She stood in the yard and looked northwest. The cloud cover was down another degree. The greenish tone was more pronounced. The air was still, completely, absolutely still. She'd never heard silence sound quite like that. She went back inside. The storm hit Thursday morning. Not gradually. Not the way most storms arrived, with a slow building of wind and a gradual thickening of snow. This one came in from the northwest, like something that had been running a long time and was done running. She heard it before she felt it. A low sound that wasn't wind exactly, more like pressure. A wave of compressed air that arrived ahead of the storm front and hit the house hard enough to shake the window frames. Then the wind, almost instantly at full force, and with it snow that was not falling but driving horizontally, so thick and so fast that the yard outside the window disappeared in under a minute. Caleb came out of his room before she'd finished pulling on her coat. "It's here," he said. "Yes." "How bad?" She looked at the window. "I can't see the barn." The barn was 30 feet from the house. Caleb said a word she'd heard from her father but never repeated. "Rope line is set," she said. "I walked it 4 times last night. I know every anchor. We can get to the barn." "The cattle." "I know. I'm going." "Not alone." "Dorian can come. You stay here with the children." He looked like he was going to argue. She looked at him until he didn't. She found Dorian already awake in the front room, sitting at the table with his coat on and his face set with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not calculation, not strategy, just the stripped-down expression of a man facing something bigger than his plans. "Barn?" he said. "Barn," she said. They went out together. The rope line saved them. She hadn't overstated how bad the visibility was. The moment they stepped off the porch, the wind hit them both full force, and the snow was everywhere, inside her coat collar, inside her gloves, in her eyes before she had them half shut. She grabbed the rope with both hands and moved, and she could feel Dorian close behind her, one hand on the rope and one on her shoulder, and she didn't shake him off because this was not the time for pride about that. The barn was 30 feet. It took 4 minutes. Inside, the cattle were agitated. The sound of the storm and the pressure drop had them restless and vocal. The milk cow pacing and the calves bunched in the corner and the 2 horses moving in tight circles in their stalls. The barn held. The walls solid, the new windbreak taking the worst of the northwest wind off the main structure. But it was not warm, and it was not quiet. "Hey," she said to Dorian, "top up everything. Don't let any of them run short." He went. She checked the water line first. The joint she'd repaired was holding, cold, but holding. She insulated it further with the canvas she'd stored in the barn for exactly this, wrapping the pipe in the joint and tying the canvas tight. The large cattle settled some as Dorian worked through the hay. She moved through the stalls, checking each animal, checking feed levels, checking the 2 late calves. They'd made it inside yesterday afternoon, Clara had been right to ask about them, and they were bunched together in the corner stall with their bodies pressed together for warmth, which was exactly what they should be doing. "Good," she said to them. They weren't listening, but she said it anyway. An hour into the storm, the barn's airflow problem started. She heard it before she saw it. A change in the sound of the wind against the north wall, a harmonic shift that meant the wind angle had changed and was now hitting the wall differently. Then she saw the hay in the northeast corner starting to move, very slightly, which meant there was a gap somewhere letting wind in, and if there was wind there was going to be a draft problem that would start pulling heat out of the space. She climbed to the loft. The gap was where two boards met on the north-facing upper wall. An old joint that had dried and separated marginally, not enough to notice in normal weather, but in this wind the pressure differential was pulling air through it. She could hear it as a whistle. She could feel it as a cold finger pressing through. She had canvas. She had the hammer she'd brought in case. She patched the gap from the inside, working one-handed while she held her position against the loft wall, the barn swaying subtly under the wind's assault. It took longer than it should have because her hands were cold and the canvas wouldn't stay put until she got a nail in each corner. When she came back down, Dorian was standing below the loft ladder looking up at her. "What was it?" he said. "Gap in the north wall board joint. Fixed." He looked at the loft wall, then at her. "You patched it with canvas and nails. In that wind. The barn wasn't moving that much." He shook his head slowly, not dismissively, just the head shake of someone encountering something they don't have a category for. The storm raged. They stayed in the barn. 2 hours later, the signal came. Came from outside. Not from the house, but from the direction of the Vale property, which was 800 yards to the northeast across open ground. Eliza heard it first because she'd been listening to the storm's sounds, cataloging them. And this was different. A bell, a large one, rung in the specific fast pattern that meant distress. 3, fast, 2, slow, repeated. Dorian heard it 10 seconds after she did. "That's Vale's signal bell," he said. She already knew. She'd heard Pete Harlow describe it once. Vale had installed a large iron bell on his barn roof years ago for emergency communication across the valley. She'd filed it away. "His fences are exposed," she said. "That whole northeast side of his property has no windbreak. If his fence lines went down in the first hour, his cattle could be loose in this storm. His men could be in trouble." Dorian looked at the barn door, at the solid wall of white beyond the gap at the bottom. "We can't go out there, not in this. I went out in it an hour ago. That was 30 feet on a rope line, you knew. I know the rope line, and I know the ground between here and the Vale property." He turned and looked at her fully. "You're not serious." "Someone's ringing that bell in this storm," she said. "They rang it because they need help. The rope line gets us to the edge of our property. After that, it's open ground to the creek crossing and then up the far bank to Vale's yard. I've walked it 3 times since I've been here. In daylight, in good weather." "Yes." "This is not that." "I know what this is," she said. She was already thinking through it. The wind direction, the landmarks she'd need to navigate by feel if she lost visual, the creek crossing and its depth this time of year, the likely distance, the time exposure. "This is Marcus Vale," Dorian said. "The man who came here to buy this ranch out from under my uncle." "I know who he is." "And you want to go help him?" She looked at Dorian. "The bell is ringing," she said. "That means someone is scared enough to ring it in this storm. Whatever Vale has done to this ranch or to Caleb doesn't change what that bell means." Dorian stared at her. "I need you to stay here," she said. "Keep the barn running. Keep the animals calm. If anything changes with the water line or the loft boards, handle it. Can you do that?" "You can't go alone. I'm not taking you. You're the only other person who can manage this barn right now." "Then you can't go?" "Eli," she said. Dorian's expression shifted. "He's 10 years old. He's 10 years old and he's walked that ground with me twice, and he's the only other person on this property who's navigated in low visibility without panicking." She held Dorian's look. "I'm not sending him. I'm taking him with me because I can't do this alone and you can't leave the barn." A long pause. Caleb will understand," she said. "Or he won't, and that's a conversation for later. Right now, the bell is ringing." She went to find Eli. He was in the house with Caleb and Clara, the three of them around the kitchen table with a candle because the light had gone wrong outside. When she came in the door, all three of them looked up. Caleb read her face first. "What happened?" he said. "Vale's distress bell. Someone's in trouble over there." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I need Eli," she said. "He's not—" Caleb stopped himself. She watched him do it, watched him look at Eli, look at her, and make the calculation that she'd already made. "He knows the ground?" "Better than anyone else available." Eli was already getting up. He didn't ask questions. He went to get his coat. Clara said, "Mama." "Stay with Caleb," Eliza said. "Don't go outside for anything. You know the rules." Clara looked at her with eyes that were too old for her face and said, "Come back." "That's the plan," Eliza said. She and Eli went out into the storm. The rope line got them to the property edge in 6 minutes. After that, it was open ground and the world was white and loud and without edges, and she gripped Eli's shoulder and he gripped her coat, and they moved by memory and feel and the angle of the wind, which she'd spent 4 days learning the shape of, and they followed it northwest by northwest across the open ground toward the sound of the bell. They crossed the creek at the shallow point she'd located in October. The water was higher than it had been, but not impossible. She went first, found the bottom, and reached back for Eli's hand, and they crossed together with the water at their knees and the cold of it like something solid, up the far bank. 200 yards. Then the fence line of the Vale property appeared out of the white, and it was down. Not a section. The whole north-facing run, posts pulled from the ground and wire in tangled heaps across the snow. Cattle were moving in the storm, shapes in the white, and she counted what she could. Then she heard shouting. She moved toward it with Eli close behind, and through the storm she found 3 of Vale's men in the lee of a collapsed section of fence, 2 of them managing loose cattle, 1 of them on the ground, and Vale himself kneeling beside the man on the ground, with his coat thrown over the man's shoulders and a look on his face that she had never seen on Marcus Vale before. Fear. Real fear. The kind that didn't calculate. The man on the ground was young, maybe 20, and his face was the color of old ash, and he had an arm at an angle that wasn't right. "He went down in the fence wire," Vale said. He looked up at her, and she watched him process who she was and what that meant. "The wire caught him, and he went down hard. I think his arm is—" "I see it," she said. She crouched beside the young man. "What's your name?" "Danny," the man said through clenched teeth. "Danny, I'm going to look at your arm. Hold still." She looked. The arm was broken. She was certain of that, and the wire had cut through his coat and shirt on the forearm, and the blood was there, but not dangerously so. The cold was the bigger problem. He'd been on the ground long enough. "We need to get him inside," she said. "Now, your house or your barn, whichever is closer." "Barn," Vale said. 30 yards. "Can your men manage the cattle?" "The ones we've got? Yes. The far ones? The far ones are going to have to wait," she said. "The man comes first." Vale looked at her. There was nothing of the man who'd stood in Caleb's yard with his document case and his careful appraisal. This was just a man looking at someone who knew what to do in a moment when he didn't. "Yes," he said. "The man comes first." They got Danny up between them, her and Vale and one of the other hands, and they moved him through the storm to the barn. She set the arm inside with a fence rail for a splint and strips of cloth from her own undershirt, with Danny's teeth on a folded rag, and Vale holding the lantern steady, the light jumping in the drafts but never quite going out. She'd set a broken bone once before. Her husband's, years ago, a horse incident. She'd known then that knowing what to do didn't make it easier to do it. It didn't now either. But she did it. When it was done and Danny was pale but stable and breathing carefully in a corner stall with blankets from the tack room piled around him, she stood up and found Eli right behind her, where he'd been the whole time, passing things when she needed them and staying out of the way when she didn't. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything. Vale came to stand beside her. He looked at Danny, looked at the splint, looked at her hands, which were still shaking slightly. She hadn't noticed until now. "You set that," he said. "I did." "Where did you learn?" "Different places. at different times. She reached for the rag to clean her hands. I paid attention. Vale was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Vane, he said, your barn, your animals. My son knows what needs doing, she said. He's been managing it with Dorian Mercer for the last 2 hours. Vale looked at Eli, who was standing by the barn door in a coat that was too light for this weather, steady as a fence post. Something moved across Vale's face. She didn't try to name it. Thank you, Vale said. The cattle in the far field, she said. When the wind turns, and it will turn, probably by morning, you'll need to move fast to find them. They'll drift east of the fence break. He nodded. And your north fence, she said. Before next season, you need a windbreak. I'll tell you what I told Caleb. Vale looked at her. You'd do that, he said. Not a question, just the flat, slightly uncomprehending statement of a man confronting something that didn't fit his model of how people worked. You need a windbreak, she said. Whether I like you or not is not the relevant question. She went to find Eli, and they started back through the storm toward home. The wind had not let up. The cold had not let up. The world was still white and loud and without edges. But she knew the angle of it now, had spent enough time inside it, that it felt less like chaos and more like a difficult terrain she was learning to read. She gripped Eli's shoulder. He gripped her coat. They crossed the creek. They found the rope line. They came home. Caleb was standing on the porch when they came back through the storm. She saw him through the white before she expected to. He'd come out to the porch edge with a lantern, which was a risk in that wind, and the light was small and yellow and barely visible, but it was there, and she aimed for it the last 50 feet through the open yard like it was the only fixed point in the world. He didn't say anything when they reached the porch. He took one look at her and one look at Eli and stepped back to let them in. That was enough. Inside, Clara was at the table with a blanket around her shoulders and her hands wrapped around a cup of something hot. She looked at Eli with an assessment that was frankly more thorough than most adults managed, decided he was intact, and said, Your coat is soaked. Creek crossing, Eli said. I know. Get it off. He got it off. Eliza sat down because her legs wanted her to, which she hadn't noticed until she stopped moving. The warmth of the room hit her like something physical. The chimney was drawing clean. She registered that automatically, the sound of it, the quality of the heat. And the fire was high, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular enclosed warmth of a house that was holding against a bad storm. Caleb set a cup in front of her. She looked up. It's not good coffee, he said, but it's hot. She wrapped her hands around it. Vale's man broke his arm in the fence wire, she said. I said it. He's stable. Barn is intact. Vale and his hands have the situation managed. Caleb stood beside the table and said nothing for a moment. You said a broken arm. I've done it before. In a storm. That's where it needed doing. He sat down across from her. Outside, the wind was going hard against the west wall, pressing in rhythmic surges that she could feel in the floor under her feet. The house absorbed each one and didn't give. She noticed this and filed it away. Dorian's still in the barn, she said. Came in about an hour ago. Went back out when the hay level in the east stall dropped. Caleb's voice was the flat kind that meant he was holding something back. He's been working. Good. He's been working hard, Caleb said, and there was something in the emphasis that made her look up. I don't know what you said to him. I asked him to handle the barn while I was gone. Must have been how you asked. She didn't know what to do with that, so she drank her coffee. Clara had moved to Eli and was now quietly and methodically fixing his hair, which had frozen in odd directions on the walk back, an act of sisterly management that Eli was tolerating with the exhausted resignation of someone who'd used up all his available resistance on the storm. The cattle? She said. All accounted for, Caleb said. I went out on the rope line to the barn twice while you were gone. Water line's holding. The loft canvas you put up is holding. Lost one fence rail on the west paddock. Wind caught it before we got it nailed down. But the rest of the paddock is standing. One fence rail. She ran through the implications. The west paddock was the one closest to the house, and if the rail was down, it meant the paddock wasn't fully secure, which meant the cattle in it could drift if they panicked. Which rail? She said. Second from the north gate. She knew the one. It had been on her list to double nail, and she hadn't gotten to it. That was her mistake, and she owned it. The cattle are inside anyway? Most of them. The 3 that wouldn't come in are in the paddock corner farthest from the break. They haven't moved. She exhaled. 3 cattle in a paddock with 1 missing fence rail in a major blizzard was a manageable risk as long as the cattle weren't panicking, and cattle in a corner were usually not panicking. She'd check at first light. "When does this break?" Caleb said. "Tomorrow morning, maybe noon. The front will push through and then it'll be clear and very cold." "How cold?" "Cold enough to freeze anything we haven't insulated." She thought through the list. The water line was insulated. The root cellar door had the new bolt. The hay was inside. The cattle had water and feed. The house chimney was clear. She ran through it twice and found one gap. "The smokehouse." "What about it?" "If the temperature drops hard after the storm clears, the drainage pipe on the smokehouse is going to freeze. It's not insulated and it's exposed on the north face. If it freezes and we try to use the smokehouse, the pipe backs up," Caleb said. "Yes, I should have caught it before the storm hit." "How do you fix it?" "Same canvas and wrap. But I can't do it until the storm clears." She set down her cup. "First thing after, before it gets colder." Caleb nodded. He didn't say you should have caught it earlier, which she appreciated because she already knew, and saying it twice didn't make the pipe any more insulated. "Sleep," he said. "You're not going to be useful to anything or anyone if you don't." She looked at the window. The storm pressed against it without mercy. "A few hours," she said. She didn't get many more than that. The storm broke at 10 the next morning. Not gently. It simply stopped, the way those systems did, the front pushing through and leaving behind a sky so clear and blue it looked painted, and a silence so absolute after all that noise that it had its own weight. The snow lay in drifts that had reorganized the landscape. The windbreak had done its job. The barnside that faced northwest had a clear zone where the break had deflected the worst of the wind, and on the other side the drifts were 4 and 5 feet deep against the fence line. She was outside before the last of the wind died. The smokehouse pipe first. She had canvas and wire already in hand, and she worked fast because the temperature had dropped exactly as she'd predicted. She could feel the quality of the cold, sharper and drier than before, the kind that bit through fabric and went after metal and standing water without hesitation. She wrapped the drainage pipe and the exposed fitting at the north junction and secured everything with wire, working with her fingers going numb, refusing to stop until it was done. When she came back around the corner of the smokehouse, she stopped. Harlan Coop was standing in the yard. Not just Harlan. Ed Garvey was there, and Thomas Riggs, and Pete Harlow with his red beard frosted white, and behind them a wagon that had come down the road from the valley with 2 more men she recognized from the feed store in town and one she didn't. Caleb was on the porch. "What is this?" she said. "Came to check," Harlan said. He had a shovel in each hand and a look on his face that was somewhere between sheepish and determined. "Heard the storm was bad. Figured Blackthorn might need digging out." "We're fine," she said. "I can see that," Harlan said. He looked at the windbreak posts, which were standing solid with only one rail displaced at the far end. He looked at the barn, the porch, the cleared path she'd already begun between the house and the outbuildings. "Looks like you were ready for it." "We were." Ed Garvey came forward. "My chimney held through the whole thing," he said. "Not a problem. First winter it's done that in 3 years." "Good," she said. "Thomas here had a water trough freeze on him," Ed said. "North side. I told him he should have talked to you before the storm." Thomas Riggs, who was young and had the expression of someone who knew he'd been told something he should have listened to, said, "I'm talking to you now." She looked at the assembled men in her yard, men who had come with shovels and wagons to help a ranch that didn't need digging out because it had prepared. Something moved through her that she didn't let reach her face. "Leave the shovels," she said. "I've got a fence rail down on the west paddock, and there are drifts across the access road that are going to cause problems when the thaw hits if we don't move them now." They moved the drifts. It took 2 hours and involved a quantity of cheerful noise that was deeply strange after the silence of the storm, And at one point, Pete Harlow and Harlan Coop had an argument about the correct technique for drift management that was so petty and so human that she found herself standing back and looking at it and feeling something odd in her chest. Eli worked alongside the men without being invited and without being turned away. Clara brought coffee out from the house twice. Caleb stood on the porch and directed the access road work with the authority of a man on his own land, which he was, and she noticed that nobody questioned him or worked around him the way people sometimes did with a man who used a cane. Dorian appeared mid-morning from the barn, where he'd apparently spent the night when the storm was at its worst. He had hay in his hair and a look about him that suggested he hadn't slept much, but wasn't ready to admit it. He stopped at the edge of the porch when he saw the men in the yard and stood there a moment processing it. She went to stand beside him. "When did they come?" he said. "This morning, to help dig out." He looked at the men working, at the cleared paths, at the windbreak standing solid, at his uncle on the porch directing traffic. "They came to help," he said flatly, like the concept required repetition to settle. "They came because your uncle has neighbors who know this place now," she said. "Because I fixed Ed Garvey's chimney and Harlan Coop's water trough, and because I showed up to 3 other properties when they needed something. People remember that." Dorian was quiet. "This is what I was building," she said. Not triumphant, just saying it. "Not just the windbreak and the water line. This." He looked at the men in the yard for a long moment. "I understand that," he said. "Do you?" He turned and looked at her. There was something different in his face than she'd seen before. Not the calculating appraisal, not the strategic coolness, just a man standing in the cold the morning after a hard storm, reckoning with something. "I came here thinking this place was past saving," he said. "I came thinking Caleb was holding on out of stubbornness, and that the kindest thing I could do was help him let go." When he paused, "I was wrong about some of it." "Some of it," she said. "The finances are still—" "I know about the finances. Spring numbers are going to have to be strong." "I know that too." He looked at the windbreak, at the barn, which had come through the storm without significant damage, at his uncle on the porch. "What do you need from me?" he said. Not strategic, not tactical, just asking. She looked at him. "I need you to stop thinking about what this land is worth to sell and start thinking about what it's worth to keep. Those are different calculations, and the second one takes longer, but it's the one that matters." He didn't say anything to that, but he didn't argue with it either. He went and picked up a shovel and joined the men clearing the access road. She watched him go and made no comment, because some things didn't need comment, they just needed to happen. Marcus Vale came to Blackthorn Ridge 3 days after the storm. He came alone this time. No lawyer, no document case, no gray horse dressed up to make a point. He rode a working horse in working clothes, and he looked like a man who'd spent 3 days dealing with the aftermath of a bad storm and had not slept enough. His man Danny's arm would heal, he said. She'd said it right. The local physician who'd made it out to the Vale property the morning after the storm had confirmed the set and said whoever had done it knew what they were doing. He said this on the porch, standing in front of Caleb, who was beside her, and he said it looking at her, which was different from every other time he'd stood on this porch. "I owe you a debt," Vale said. "No debt," she said. "Danny needed help." "I'm not talking about Danny." He paused, looked around the yard at the windbreak, at the paths cleared between buildings, at the property that had come through the storm in better shape than his own, and he knew it. "I'm talking about what you've built here." A beat. "I didn't take it seriously. I thought Caleb was holding a losing hand, and I thought you were— I didn't know what you were. An inconvenience, maybe." Caleb said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing in ways that communicated everything. "I was wrong," Vale said, and it came out with the difficulty of a man who didn't say those words often, but was saying them now because they were true, and he had decided that truth required them. "About this property, about what it could be." He looked at Eliza. "About you." She held his gaze. "And the offer." "Withdrawn." He said it plainly. "I won't be bringing it back." She nodded. "I'll be building a windbreak on my north property line in spring," he said. "I'd like your advice on the placement." "Come in April," she said. "Bring your survey map." He nodded. He looked at Caleb, but something passed between the two men. Old, complicated, not for her to interpret. I should have been a better neighbor, Vale said. Caleb said, You're being one now. Vale left. She and Caleb stood on the porch and watched the horse move down the road until it was small against the white landscape. He means it, Caleb said. I think so. Men like that are the same as any other men, she said. They move when the ground shifts under them. We shifted the ground. Caleb leaned on his cane and looked at the valley. The snow lay clean and deep, and the sky was that impossible blue that only comes after a hard storm has washed everything. The calves came through the storm well, he said. They did. The two on the two-stage feed, they've put on weight. I know. I checked them this morning. Spring numbers might be better than I thought. She looked at him sideways. Might be, he said carefully. Might be, she agreed. He was quiet a moment, then, Dorian's been in the barn every morning this week. I noticed. He asked me about the calving schedule, what to expect and when. She said nothing. He's not going back to Cheyenne when he said he was, Caleb said. She hadn't known this. She absorbed it. Does he want to stay? He wants to see spring, Caleb said. He said he wants to see if the numbers come out like you said they would. And if they do? Caleb looked out at the valley. Then he said he might have been wrong about more things than he thought. She took that in. What about the sale idea? Hasn't mentioned it in a week, Caleb said. She let the silence hold. I want to talk to you about something, Caleb said. His voice changed quality, not formal exactly, but deliberate, the way he got when he'd thought something through before he said it. All right, she said, come inside. They sat at the kitchen table. She poured coffee because her hands wanted something to do and coffee was always available. Caleb sat with his cane across his knees, which was how he sat when he was going to say something important, she'd noticed, because it freed up both hands. You've been here 2 months, he said. Yes. When I hired you, I said room and board and wages and spring if you stayed. He wrapped his hands around his cup. That's not what I want to offer you now. She waited. The ranch needs more than a season, he said. You know that. Yes. And what you've built here, the windbreak, the repairs, the relationships in the valley, that's not one winter's work. That's the foundation of something. He looked at his cup. My wife and I didn't have children. I've been thinking about what happens to this place when I'm gone since she died. Dorian's one possibility, but he's not. He doesn't have the feeling for it. Not the way you do. She sat very still. I'm not talking about charity, he said quickly, which told her he'd anticipated her reaction. I'm talking about a legal arrangement, a formal share of the operation in exchange for what you're already doing, with a clear path, documented, witnessed, to ownership if the operation continues to improve and if you stay. The kitchen was quiet. The fire was burning clean. The wind outside was light and dry, nothing like 3 days ago. She thought about the travel bag beside the door of her small room, how she'd moved it under the bed last week without thinking about it, how she hadn't moved it back. Caleb, she said. I've talked to Dorian, he said. He doesn't object. He'd rather see the place flourish than sit on a deed that doesn't mean anything. A pause. He said, and I want you to know he said this himself, that you earned it, in the storm. She looked at the table. I need to think, she said. Take the time you need. I have children, she said. Whatever I agree to, they're part of it. Clara and Eli, they're not guests here. If I'm building something, they're building it with me. Caleb nodded. That was assumed, he said. I should have said it first. She looked up at him. Eli noticed the fence post bowing before I did, Caleb said. Boy's got an eye. I'm not going to waste that. She almost said something. She stopped herself and looked at the window instead, at the snow and the clear sky and the line of windbreak posts standing dark against the white. Give me a few days, she said. Of course. She got up and washed her cup and went to find the children. She found Eli in the barn with Dorian. This was not something she'd expected to find. Dorian Mercer sitting on an upturned feed bucket with his good coat off for once, in his shirt sleeves, showing Eli the difference between the grain bags by quality and age, which she could hear as she came through the barn door, Dorian's voice patient and specific in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "The newer bags are on the left because I rotated them this morning," Dorian was saying. "Always move the older stock to where it's used first. If you let the new stuff sit on top of old stock, the old stock goes bad under it, and you don't know until it's too late and something's already eaten bad grain." Eli was listening with that careful attention of his head slightly tilted. "My uncle used to do this right," Dorian said. "Before. For a few years he let it slip. Things slip when people are managing alone." He paused. "That's why a second pair of eyes matters. You understand?" "Yes," Eli said. "Good." Dorian looked up and saw her. He didn't change his expression in any significant way, just acknowledged her presence with a nod. "We were talking about the grain rotation." "I heard," she said. "He's quick," Dorian said, meaning Eli, matter-of-factly. "I know," she said. Eli looked between them with the expression of someone who'd decided not to comment on being discussed. She stayed in the barn and worked through the afternoon feed, and Dorian and Eli talked about grain and water and cattle and the particular challenges of late-season calving, and she listened while she worked and thought about what Caleb had said and what she had to answer. She thought about the travel bag under her bed. She thought about her husband, who'd been a careful man, and about the farm in Kansas, and about every place she'd stopped since and left, and every place that had turned her away. She thought about the 40 miles from Rawlins with the broken handcart and the bad wheel and the strip of leather from her coat. She thought about the pencil mark on her wrist that had smeared in the rain. She thought about Clara's face when she'd said, "Come back." She thought about Eli, 10 years old, crossing the creek in a blizzard, gripping her coat in both hands, trusting her. She thought about the rope line she'd strung between the house and the barn, anchored to solid points, tested 4 times, walked until she could do it without looking. She thought about the chimney pulling clean, the water line holding, the hay dry in the interior storage, the windbreak standing in the wind. She thought about the travel bag under her bed. She told Caleb yes that evening. She didn't make a speech about it. She came into the front room where he was reading, or not reading, looking at a page he wasn't turning, and she sat in the chair across from him and said, "Yes, but I want it written right. I want a lawyer, not Price, someone from Rawlins who doesn't work for anyone in this valley. I want the children's position clear in the document, and I want it witnessed by Ed Garvey and Ruth, because they're the most honest people I've met here." Caleb set down the notebook. "Ruth Garvey," he said. "You want Ed Garvey's wife as a witness. She's sharper than Ed, no offense to Ed. No offense taken. I've always known that." A pause. "Done." She stood up. "Eliza," he said. She stopped. "My wife's name was Margaret," he said. "She'd have liked you." She didn't know what to do with that either, so she nodded once and went to bed. The lawyer came from Rawlins 12 days after the storm, when the road was clear enough for a wagon. His name was Alton Webb, and he was a small, precise man in his 60s who'd been practicing land law in Wyoming for 30 years, and who looked at the document Caleb described to him with the expression of someone presented with a moderately interesting puzzle. He asked questions for 2 hours. He asked them of Caleb, and then of Eliza, and then, briefly but not dismissively, of Dorian, who answered with a directness that surprised her. "Do you contest this arrangement?" Webb asked him. "No," Dorian said. "You understand this affects the inheritance structure." "I understand what it affects," Dorian said. "My uncle has the right to arrange his own property. And Mrs. Vane has done more for this ranch in 2 months than I've done in 30 years of being related to it." A short pause. "Write it clean." Webb wrote it clean. It took 3 more days to complete. Webb was meticulous, which she respected. Every condition was specific. Her share of the operating partnership began immediately. The path to ownership was tied to operational benchmarks that she and Webb and Caleb negotiated around the kitchen table for most of an afternoon, with the children doing their schoolwork at the far end of the table, and Dorian in and out making coffee and occasionally saying things that were surprisingly useful. The spring cattle numbers she'd projected were one of the benchmarks. She'd set them herself. She wasn't worried about them. The windbreak maintenance was another. She wasn't worried about that either. On the day Webb left with the signed and witnessed copies, she stood on the porch in the cold and watched his wagon take the access road toward the valley. Edgarvey and Ruth were just ahead of him, Ruth turning once to wave from the wagon seat. Caleb came to stand beside her. "How does it feel?" he said. "Terrifying," she said. He looked at her. "The benchmarks are achievable," she said, "but they're not guaranteed. Spring can go wrong. Cattle prices can shift. The bank's patience is finite. There are at least 8 ways this doesn't work out." 9, he said. "I came up with one more last night." "Which one?" Dorian could change his mind. She thought about Dorian in the barn this morning, going over the calving schedule with Eli, both of them hunched over the ledger with the specific concentration of 2 people who cared about the same problem. "He won't," she said. "No," Caleb said. "I don't think he will." They stood there in the cold. The windbreak was solid, and the air coming down from the northwest was cold but clean, no longer the held, waiting quality of the days before the storm. The valley below was white and quiet, and the road Webb had just taken curved down toward a cluster of far buildings that she could name now. Garvey's place, the Coop property, the Harlow barn with its distinctive red roof, the Riggs homestead at the valley floor. She knew the landscape now. She'd walked most of it. "The smokehouse pipe held," she said, because she'd been meaning to say it and kept forgetting. "I know," Caleb said, "through the cold snap after the storm. The canvas wrap worked. I'll replace it with proper insulation in spring." "All right." She heard the door open behind her and turned. Eli and Clara came out onto the porch, Eli pulling on his coat, Clara with the blanket she'd claimed as hers around her shoulders. "Are they gone?" Clara said. "Just left." Clara looked down the road. Then she looked at Eliza with the particular directness that had always been her way of asking without asking. "We're staying?" she said. Eliza looked at the road and the valley and the land that had her name on a document now, at the windbreak, at the barn, at the chimney drawing clean in the winter air. "We're staying," she said. Clara went back inside. Simple as that. The biggest answer she'd needed, received and processed and filed, and then back to whatever she'd been doing, because that was Clara. Eli stood on the porch for another moment. He looked at the windbreak, then at the sky. "What's the weather doing?" he said. She looked northwest, blue sky, clean air, a high-pressure system that would hold for at least a week. "Clear," she said. "For a while." He nodded, satisfied, and went inside to get back to his schoolwork. She stayed on the porch a little longer. The cold was honest and the sky was clear, and the land was exactly as hard and as worth keeping as she'd thought it was. The first morning, she'd stood on the northwest ridge with her notebook and looked at the shape of the wind. She'd told Caleb it was terrifying. It was. It was also, for the first time in 3 years, exactly where she was supposed to be. She went inside and started making supper, and the house was warm around her, and she didn't think once about the door. Spring came late to the valley that year, the way it sometimes did in Wyoming. Not gradually, not with the slow warming that made preparation easy, but in a single week when the temperature shifted 12 degrees and the snow melt came fast and all at once, and the ground went from frozen to saturated before anyone was ready. Eliza was ready. She'd been watching for it since February, when the light started changing. Not warmer, just longer, the afternoons stretching out by minutes that accumulated into something you could feel. She'd started the drainage channels in March, cutting shallow trenches along the barn's east face to direct snowmelt away from the foundation, because the east side was where the ground sloped toward the building, and in a fast thaw that slope became a problem. Caleb had watched her work the trenches for 2 days before he said anything. "You're expecting a fast melt?" he said. "Yes." "What makes you think—" "The frost depth this year was shallower than normal," she said. "The ground didn't freeze as deep. When it lets go, it's going to let go fast." He looked at the trenches. He looked at the east barn wall. He went inside without agreeing or disagreeing, and the next morning he was out early with a second trenching tool working the line she'd marked. She didn't say anything about that either. The calves came in April. The 2 she'd put on the 2-stage feed over winter had come through exactly as she'd projected. Solid animals, good weight, with the particular alertness that came from animals that had been properly nourished through a hard season. Eli had been managing their morning feeding since February, first with supervision and then on his own, and the calves had become, in some way she hadn't anticipated, his project. He tracked their weight in the ledger. He adjusted their feed ratios when she suggested it. He noticed 2 weeks before she did that the larger of the two had a slight asymmetry in the way he was carrying his left rear leg. He came to her in the evening. "Something's off with the big one, Shouted," he said. "Left rear. He's not lame, but he's not right either." She went and looked. He was correct. A minor soft tissue issue, probably from a strain in the barn during the storm. Nothing serious, but worth managing. She adjusted the feed pen and kept the calf on lighter movement for 10 days, and Eli checked him every morning and reported what he found, and she never once had to ask him to. Caleb noticed this. She caught him one morning in the barn doorway watching Eli work through the morning check, and his expression was the particular kind that people wear when they're seeing something that fixes a worry they'd held for a long time without naming it. She didn't mention it. Some things were worth more unspoken. The spring cattle sale happened the second week of May. It was not a perfect sale. Nothing in this business was perfect. Prices had shifted slightly from what she'd projected, down 3% on the younger stock because there'd been more supply in the region than usual, which nobody had predicted, and she took that as a lesson about the limits of projection and stored it for next year. But the two heavy calves came in over what she'd estimated. The condition of the herd, animals that had come through a hard winter better than most of the valley's cattle, got comments from the buyers. One buyer from the northern counties asked Caleb directly what he'd changed. Caleb said, "Management." The buyer looked around the yard, looked at the windbreak, looked at the barn. "Good results," the buyer said. "Getting better," Caleb said. The final number was not what she'd hoped for. It was better than what the benchmark required. Not by a lot, by enough that she sat with the ledger that night after everyone was in bed and looked at the number for a long time before she wrote it down. The bank debt was not cleared. It wasn't going to be cleared in one season, but it was reduced to a level that changed the bank's posture entirely. She knew this because Alton Webb had spoken to the Rollins branch manager on their behalf and reported back that the manager had used the word sustainable, which was the specific word she'd been working towards since November. Sustainable. Not saved, not finished. Sustainable, which meant they had ground to stand on going forward. She wrote the number down and closed the ledger. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, thinking about the distance between where they'd been in November and where they were in May, and about everything that existed in that distance. The chimney, the water line, the windbreak, the storm, the creek crossing. Danny's arm, the document signed at this table with Ed Garvey and Ruth as witnesses. She thought about what it cost to build something. Not in money, though money was real and mattered, but in the daily accounting of showing up and doing the work when you didn't know if it was going to hold, when the ground was uncertain under you and the sky was telling you something bad was coming, and the people around you hadn't yet decided whether you were worth trusting. That cost was the one nobody talked about, the internal one. The private ledger of deciding, every morning, to stay. She'd made that decision every day since November. She closed the ledger and went to bed. Dorian stayed. It had become clear by February that he wasn't leaving, though he hadn't made an announcement about it. He'd simply stopped talking about Cheyenne and started talking about the north pasture fencing and the question of whether they should expand the herd size in the fall. Caleb didn't remark on it. Eliza didn't remark on it. Eli began including Dorian in his morning barn report without being told to, and that was probably the most complete form of acceptance available on the property. What changed in Dorian was hard to name exactly. He was still calculating. She didn't think that would ever leave him, and she wasn't sure she'd want it to, because a ranch needed someone who could run numbers, and she was better at reading the land than reading the ledger, and they were learning to work around that difference without either of them having to say it explicitly. But the calculation had turned towards something. In November, he'd been calculating what the land was worth to someone else. By May, he was calculating what it would take to add 40 acres on the north boundary that had come available when the Tillman family moved on. It was the same skill deployed toward a completely different end, and she thought that was what people actually meant when they talked about someone changing. Not their nature, but what their nature was pointed at. She told him this one afternoon when they were walking the north boundary line, looking at the Tillman parcel. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous interpretation," he said. "It's an accurate one. I was ready to help Vale take this land," he said. "Not defensive, just stating it." "I know." "You knew at the time?" "I suspected." He was quiet again, looking at the boundary markers. "You didn't say anything." "You weren't my problem to manage," she said. "Caleb made his own decisions. I just kept working. And trusted that working would be enough." "I trusted that the work was right," she said. "Whether it was enough was going to depend on things I couldn't control." He considered this for a while. "That must be a hard way to live." "It's the only honest way I know," she said. They walked the boundary and measured the Tillman parcel and talked about what fencing it would take and whether the water access was right. And it was a completely practical conversation about land and resources. And it was also something else at the same time. Two people who had started as adversaries finding out they were better, as something more like partners, which was a thing neither of them had planned and which had arrived through the same accretion of daily work that everything else at Blackthorn Ridge had been built from. Nothing dramatic. Nothing resolved in a single moment. Just two people walking a fence line, getting the measure of something worth keeping. Marcus Vale came in April, as she'd asked, with his survey map. He came alone, on the working horse, in the same clothes he'd worn the morning after the storm, and she thought that was probably intentional, that he'd made some decision about who he was going to be in his dealings with Blackthorn Ridge going forward, and the clothes were part of it. She spread his survey map on the kitchen table, and they went through it for 2 hours. She showed him where the wind came from, where the natural terrain would amplify or deflect it, where a windbreak would do the most work for the least material investment. He asked intelligent questions. He'd clearly been studying the problem since she'd mentioned it the morning after the storm. At one point he said, "I could have hired someone to do this." "You could have," she said. "Why didn't I think of it before?" She thought about how to answer honestly. "You were thinking about acquisition," she said. "When you're looking at land as something to buy, you see its value. When you're living with land, you see what it needs. Those are different ways of looking." He was quiet. "The people I was buying out," he said. "The families who sold." She waited. "Some of them didn't have to go," he said. "Not if someone had thought this way about their land." He was looking at the map and not at her. "I was looking at assets. I wasn't looking at people trying to hold something together." She didn't say anything. He wasn't asking her to say anything. "I can't fix that," he said. "No," she said. "But you can be a different neighbor going forward." He looked up. "That's not absolution," she said. "It's just the only direction available." He nodded. "Fair enough." They finished with the map. She marked the windbreak line in pencil and noted the post spacing and the brush species that would establish fastest on his soil type, different from the ridge soil at Blackthorn, drier, better drainage, which meant different establishment timelines. When he left, he paused at the door. "What you did," he said. "In the storm. For Danny. You didn't know how it was going to go. You didn't know if the storm would break before you made it back." "No," she said. "That's not something most people would do." She thought about that, about what she would say to someone who asked her why she'd gone out into the storm for a man who tried to take the ranch she was building. She'd thought about it a few times since, when she was doing repetitive work and her mind had room to wander. Danny was 20 years old, and he was hurt and he needed help, she said. What Vale had done or was trying to do, that was a separate problem. It was going to get resolved or it wasn't, and the way it got resolved wasn't going to be changed by leaving a hurt kid in the storm. Vale looked at her. "The kind of person who would leave Danny in that storm," she said, "is not the kind of person who could build what I'm building here. Those two things are connected. You can't be one kind of person in a storm and a different kind when the weather is good. It doesn't work that way." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it does." He left. She folded the survey map and set it on the shelf for when the work started in spring, and went to see what needed doing next. Summer brought its own problems, as summer always did. The drainage channels she'd cut in March had worked for the thaw, but needed reinforcing for the rain season, which came harder than usual in June and turned the east side of the property into a negotiation between water and land that required 3 days of work with Eli and Dorian to resolve properly. One of the older cattle developed a respiratory problem that cost them 2 weeks of extra management and came within a bad night of becoming something worse. The windbreak needed a full inspection and 4 rail replacements where the freeze-thaw cycle had worked the joints loose. None of it was smooth. None of it was finished. That was the nature of land. It didn't resolve into a final condition where the work was done. It moved continuously, season by season, problem by problem. And what you built was not a state of completion, but a capacity for response. She'd learned this from her father, though he'd never said it in those words. He'd shown it by just going out every morning and dealing with whatever the land was doing that day. She'd thought as a child that this was simply what work was, endless and repetitive and not particularly meaningful. She understood it differently now. The capacity to respond was itself what you were building. Everything else was in service of that. She said something like this to Ruth Garvey one afternoon in July when Ruth had come over to return a tool she'd borrowed and stayed for coffee, which was becoming a semi-regular occurrence. Ruth had a way of asking questions that sounded casual and weren't. "Do you ever feel like it's too much?" Ruth said. "All of it. The responsibility." Eliza thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," she said, "in the middle of the night when I can't sleep and I'm running the list of things that could go wrong. Yes." "What do?" "I get up and fix the thing that's most likely to fail first," she said. "The list gets shorter. Eventually I can sleep." Ruth smiled into her coffee. "Ed says you're the most practical person he's ever met." "Ed means it as a compliment?" "From Ed. Absolutely." Ruth set down her cup. "He told Harlan Coop that if he'd had your brain on his property 20 years ago, he'd still have the south pasture he sold off in '79. She didn't know how to receive that, so she poured more coffee. "People talk about you," Ruth said. "In town, at the feed store." "I know. They talk about the storm, about Vale's man, about the chimney and the windbreak." Ruth looked at her directly, which was always Ruth's way. "They talk about you differently than they did in November." "November, I was a widow with 2 children and a broken handcart," Eliza said. "You still are," Ruth said. "That's not what changed." She understood what Ruth meant. The facts of her situation hadn't changed. The widowhood, the children, the lack of anything she hadn't carried in herself. What had changed was what those facts were attached to. She was a widow with 2 children and a broken handcart who had fixed the chimney and walked into the storm and set the broken arm and strung the rope line and driven the posts and built the thing that stood. The facts were the same. The context around them was different. She thought about all the ranches that had turned her away, the doors that hadn't opened. She didn't think about them with bitterness, exactly. Or maybe there was still some bitterness there, the honest kind that doesn't pretend things weren't hard. But she thought about them differently than she used to. Those closed doors had sent her here. Whatever had needed to be true to get her to Blackthorn Ridge, those closed doors were part of it, and she couldn't resent the path that had brought her somewhere she wanted to be. That didn't mean the path had been fair. It hadn't been. Women with her skills and her work had been turned away for reasons that had nothing to do with their skills or their work, and that was a true thing that didn't stop being true because her particular story had turned out well. She held both of those things at the same time, which was the only honest way to hold them. In late summer, Caleb had a bad week. His leg, the old injury, whatever it was, she'd never asked and he'd never said, went through a period where the pain was visibly worse, and he moved less and sat more and had the particular interior quality of a man trying not to show something he couldn't hide. She didn't fuss at him. She knew he wouldn't tolerate fussing. She adjusted what needed adjusting without comment. The daily schedule, the task assignments, the things that required mobility. And she made sure the work got done through other means, and she left him alone when he needed to be alone, which was often in that week. On the 4th day, he said, from his chair by the window, "You don't ask about the leg." "It's not my leg," she said. "Most people ask." "What do you tell them when they ask?" A pause. "That it's old and it's mine, and it'll sort itself out." "Does it?" "Usually." Another pause. Eventually. She kept working at the table. She was sewing a tear in one of Eli's shirts, which was not glamorous work, but was the kind of thing that piled up if you didn't do it. Horse accident, Caleb said, 12 years ago. Something broke in the knee that didn't heal right. Doctors said it would give me trouble in cold weather and in damp, and they were right. He said it in the flat tone of a man sharing a fact, not looking for sympathy. Does it affect what you can do? Some things, ladder work, rough ground in bad conditions. A pause. Getting old doesn't help. No, she said, it doesn't. You're good at not needing me to be something I'm not, he said. She looked up from the shirt. I mean that as a compliment, he said. Some people, they need you to be functional or capable in a specific way. And when you're not, they either worry at you or they start going around you in ways that make you feel like furniture. You don't do either. She thought about that. You run this ranch, she said. You know it better than anyone. A bad week in your leg doesn't change that. He looked at her steadily. A lot of people would see the cane and make a different calculation. I've seen you work, she said. The cane is part of how you work. It's not what your work is. He was quiet for a while. Eli asked me yesterday about the east pasture rotation, he said, whether we should split the herd differently next season. What did you tell him? I told him what I thought, and then I asked him what he thought. A pause. His reasoning was sound. Better than sound, actually. He's been watching everything since November, she said. He doesn't miss much. He's going to be good at this, Caleb said. When he's older, if he wants it. She kept her eyes on the shirt. That's his to decide. I know, I'm just saying that the knowledge is going in. Whether he uses it here or somewhere else, it's going in. She finished the seam. He loves this land, she said. He wouldn't say that. He'd say he's interested in the drainage problem on the north pasture or the question of soil type on the Tillman parcel, but that's what it is. Caleb made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was easier now than it had been in November, more used. His bad week ended. He didn't mention it again. The second winter came and she was ready for it the way you're ready for something when you've done it once and learned from the doing, not without difficulty. The second winter had its own specific character, drier than the first, less snow but colder, the kind of cold that was insidious because it was quiet and didn't announce itself the way the blizzard had. The windbreak handled the wind load exactly as she'd designed it to. The drainage channels she'd reinforced in summer handled the freeze-thaw without damage to the barn foundation. Two things she hadn't anticipated. A crack in the north pasture water line that she'd thought was lower risk than the barn line and had been wrong about, and an early December ice storm that took out 3 of the windbreak rails on the south end where she'd used lighter timber than the north end because she'd miscalculated the load requirements. She fixed both. The waterline repair took a day and a half in genuinely miserable cold. The windbreak rails took an afternoon. She wrote in the notebook a new one, the third since she'd arrived. What she'd gotten wrong and why, and what she'd do differently, and what it told her about the property's specific vulnerabilities going forward. Learning from mistakes required knowing exactly what the mistake was and not softening it into something easier to look at. She'd learned that the hard way before Blackthorn Ridge, and she kept the discipline of it now, and the notebook was part of that, the honest record that didn't spare herself. Eli read the notebook sometimes, she knew. He didn't ask permission. She didn't withdraw permission. The notebooks were, in some sense, a form of teaching, the written version of everything her father had explained out loud while she handed him tools and paid attention. She was the kind of mother she was partly because of who he'd been, and she thought about that sometimes, about inheritance that had nothing to do with land or money, the kind that moved through attention and repetition and the patient modeling of how to deal with a difficult world, not by avoiding the difficult parts, but by developing a reliable way of meeting them. That was what she wanted to leave her children. Not the ranch, though she hoped the ranch would be there, the orientation toward hard things, the knowledge that difficulty was not a sign that you'd gone wrong. Sometimes it meant you'd gone exactly right, into the place where the real work was. In the third spring, Alton Webb came back to Blackthorn Ridge. He came to review the benchmarks in the operating agreement and to make the adjustments the agreement had specified were due at the 3-year point. It was a legal visit, procedural, but she'd been aware of it coming for months and had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything. Thoroughly and early. The numbers were there. Not perfectly. There had been a cattle price dip in the second year that had pushed one benchmark back, and Webb had built a provision into the original agreement for exactly that kind of external factor, which she'd thought at the time was optimistic on his part and now thought was simply experienced. The adjusted timeline still put her where she needed to be. Webb reviewed everything at the kitchen table with the same precision he'd brought the first time, while Caleb sat across from him and Dorian stood at the window with his coffee, and Eli, who was 13 now, and tall, and had the composed attention of someone much older, sat at the far end of the table doing the thing he did where he was ostensibly doing something else, but was actually listening to everything. At the end of the review, Webb looked up and said, "The benchmarks are met. The adjustment clause applies to the 2-year price dip. The path to ownership is clear." She said, "When?" "Barring significant disruption, 18 months. Caleb looked at the table. Not sad. Something else. The expression of a man watching something he'd set in motion arrive at its destination. "That's right," he said. "Any challenges you anticipate?" Webb said. She thought about it honestly. "The North Pasture water line needs attention before next winter. The Windbreak South Rail needs heavier timber in the replacement. The Tillman parcel. Dorian and I have been managing it, but we haven't fully integrated the cattle rotation across the new acreage, and we'll need to do that before fall." Webb made notes. "Nothing that changes the trajectory?" he said. "Nothing that changes the trajectory," she said. Dorian said from the window, without turning, "She's underselling it. The operation is producing better numbers than anything I saw when I came here 3 years ago. The valley knows what this ranch is now. 2 buyers approached us at the May sale specifically because of the herd condition." He turned. "She's not going to say that herself." Eliza looked at Dorian. "You are underselling it," he said simply. She looked at Webb. "The operation is stable," she said, "and it's growing." Webb smiled. A small, precise smile that suited him. "I'm aware," he said. "I do hear things in Rollins." But what she hadn't been prepared for, in all her preparation, was the specific feeling of a particular October morning 4 years after she'd arrived, pulling a broken handcart down a frozen road. She was in the yard before anyone else was up. This was normal. She was always first out, always doing the morning read of the property, the sky, the animals, the list. She was standing at the edge of the yard looking northwest, as she always did, checking the horizon. The sky was clear. The first cold was in the air, but not the serious cold. That was still weeks away. The windbreak stood solid and had begun, in its 4th year, to fill in where she'd planted the brush along the outside rail. You could see it becoming what she'd imagined it would be, a real barrier, living and established, not just posts and rail, but something with depth and permanence. She heard the door and turned. Clara came out onto the porch. She was 12 now and had her mother's way of moving, economical, deliberate, not wasting motion. She had also developed, over 4 years, a relationship with the morning that Eliza recognized because it was her own. Clara stood on the porch and looked at the sky and then at her mother. "Clear," Clara said. "Clear," Eliza said. Clara came down into the yard and stood beside her, and they both looked northwest for a moment. "The windbreak's filling in," Clara said. "By spring it'll be solid," Eliza said. Clara nodded. She'd been helping with the brush maintenance since she was 10, not because she'd been assigned to it, but because she'd started doing it and nobody had stopped her. They stood in the morning quiet. "Mama," Clara said. "Yes." "Do you remember the cart? The broken one?" She did. She could feel the weight of it, the particular balance when the bad wheel dragged, the strip of leather from the coat. "I remember." "I was scared," Clara said. "I didn't say that then. I didn't want to make it harder." She looked at her daughter. "You were 8, she said. "I know, but I was scared." Clara looked at the windbreak, the barn, the slope of the ridge behind the house. "I'm not scared anymore." She didn't say anything for a moment. The honest thing to say would have been complex, and that she still felt fear regularly, that the fear didn't leave, but that you learned to work alongside it, that the absence of fear wasn't the goal and wasn't actually available, and that what Clara felt now wasn't the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger. But Clara was 12, and the morning was clear, and some things could wait for the right time. "Good," she said. Clara looked at her sideways. "You're still scared sometimes." "Yes." "But you do things anyway." "That's the only way I know how." Clara considered this. Is that what courage is? She thought about the storm and the creek and Danny's arm and the rope line she'd walked 4 times in the dark, so she'd know it without looking. She thought about Rollins and the broken cart and the closed doors and the pencil mark that had smeared in the rain. She thought about the benchmarks and the notebook and the waterline repair in miserable cold and the south windbreak rail she'd gotten wrong and fixed. "I think courage is deciding that the thing in front of you matters enough to be scared of," she said, "and then doing it anyway. That's the whole of it, as best I can tell." Clara was quiet for a while. "The north pasture line," Clara said. "The water line you said needs work before winter." "Yes. Eli said we should do it before the first ground freeze. He said we have maybe 3 weeks. He's right. He wants to start tomorrow." She looked at her daughter. "Do you want to help?" Clara looked at the pasture, at the clear sky, at the windbreak filling in along the northwest ridge. "Yes," she said. They went inside to start breakfast, and the morning moved forward the way mornings did on that land, with the particular weight of work that needed doing, and the particular steadiness of people who had decided over and over, day after day, to do it. Caleb was up when they came in. Eli was already in the barn. Dorian's door was opening. The fire was ready to be built up, the coffee to be made, the list to be run through, the day to be started. She built the fire. She thought about the travel bag still under the bed in her room, empty for 3 years. She'd thought about taking it out and putting it somewhere else, somewhere less pointed. She'd left it where it was, in the end. She wanted to remember what it felt like to have it beside the door. Not as a wound, but as a measurement. The distance between then and now was the size of what she'd built, and she wanted to keep knowing that size, wanted to feel it the way you feel a healed thing that once wasn't healed, not with grief, but with the precise, honest knowledge of what it cost and what it made. The fire caught. The house warmed. Outside, the windbreak stood against the northwest sky, filling in year by year the living kind of barrier that grew stronger with time instead of weaker. The kind that, if you tended it, would be there long after you were. She'd learned that from the land. The land had learned it from her. That was how it worked in the end. Not the giving of a thing, but the long mutual teaching between a person and a place. What you brought to it, what it asked of you, what you became inside that asking. She poured the first coffee of the morning and called for the children and listened to the house come alive around her. And she was home, and she had built it, and it was enough.